Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to part 15 of Quranic Contemplations, where we contemplate selected verses of the Quran. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the 15th juz of the Quran. The first ayah we're going to be looking at is the first verse of Surah Al Asiri, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the miraculous journey which the Prophet ﷺ went on when he was taken from the Masjid in Mecca, from Masjid al-Haram to Masjid al-Aqsa. And then, of course, we know from there he ascended into the heavens and he went on his night journey, or the Mi'raj, the ascension into the heavens. And what I want to focus on in this ayah is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even though he's talking about this miraculous event, one of the most miraculous events which ever took place in the lifetime of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he describes and talks about the Prophet ﷺ as his servant. And we would think, because of the magnitude of this night, the greatness of this night, the significance of this night, we would think that maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would call him by his title of being a messenger or being a prophet, or even by his name. Why didn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say Asra bi nabiyhi wa asra bi rasulihi wa asra bi Muhammad? Why specifically did he use servant? Because there are many servants. There are, everyone is a servant of Allah. Every believer in Allah is a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So why did he use this explicit title for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And this in fact shows us the great honor and the greatest blessing and the respect that is given to the title of being the servant and slave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning, Allah Azza wa Jal is using this title describing the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam when he went on this journey. So it's not a title which shows how lowly a person is in the sight of Allah. In fact, it's one of the most honorable things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can describe and call a person with, using the title slave. It's an honorable thing. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions it here when he is referring to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And of course, we know also that the greatest names that a person can have are names that begin with the word Abd. So the greatest names, as the Messenger of Allah told us, are Abdullah and Abdurrahman, slave of Allah and the slave of Ar-Rahman. And so one of the most honorable titles a person can be given is in fact to be called a slave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is why Allah Azza wa Jalla calls him his slave, his servant. And he associates the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with him. Allah associates the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam, the slave of Allah, to him, showing the closeness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam, and also vice versa. The second verse we're going to go through is in Surah Kahf, ayah number 45. And in this ayah, it's a beautiful parable, a beautiful example of how Allah Azza wa Jal compares a person's life, his worldly life, to water. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاضْرِبْ لَهُمْ مَثَلَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا كَمَاءٍ أَنزَلْنَاهُ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ. Present to them the example of life, of the life of this world, being like water which we send down from the sky. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala compares the life of this world to water. And one may ask, what's the similarities between life and water? Why is the life of this world being compared to water? How are they similar? How is the life of this world similar to water? And subhanAllah, when we reflect and we look at what the scholar said regarding the similarities, we'd be amazed, and it really makes us appreciate the beauty of how Allah compares things in the Quran. From the similarities that they've mentioned, first of all, is that both water and the worldly life don't stay in one place. Water moves around. Just like water moves around, one's worldly life also moves around. It doesn't stay in one place. One day isn't the same as another day. There's always going to be different things happening. Things may be better, things may be worse. You may have a high, you may have a low, but things will never stay the same. Things will always be moving. Things will always be static. Another difference between, or another thing that makes water similar to the life of this world, is that water and the world life don't always stay in the same state. So they don't stay in the same place, but at the same time, they don't stay in the same state. We know water has different states. It can become ice. It can be water. Can be liquid. It can be a solid. It can be a gas. So it has different states. Likewise, the worldly life also has different states. A person can be going through different emotions, different circumstances, and different situations. So again, you have this similarity between the water and the worldly life. Also, water can disappear. Water can become gas and it can just disappear, it can evaporate. Likewise, the worldly life can also disappear, because the worldly life isn't here forever. Things we may have at one point in our lives, and we may not have them at another point in our lives. Or life itself could disappear and our lives could end. Another similarity is how whoever comes into contact with water is afflicted by it and becomes wet. So when you come into contact with water, you become wet. You're affected by the water you've come into contact with. Likewise, when you involve yourself in this world, you'll also become afflicted with this world with regards to its trials and tribulations. So you're afflicted with the water when you come into contact with it, and likewise you're afflicted with this world when you come into contact with this world. And finally, another similarity, and of course there could be so many other similarities that the scholars have mentioned, we're only mentioning some of them, is that the right amount of water, when a person uses it, it can be beneficial for him. But too much water can be harmful. Like even when a person drinks water, we know there's a certain amount of water that if you drink it, it's beneficial for you. But if you have too much water, it can actually harm you. It can even kill you. So the right amount of water can be beneficial. Too much can be harmful, just like this world. If you utilize and use whatever Allah Azza wa Jal has blessed you with, you can actually take advantage and it can be beneficial. But if you overindulge in this world, if you take too much and you take more than you need and take more than you're supposed to, and you completely immerse yourself in the dunya, then it's not going to be beneficial for you. It's actually going to be harmful for you. And those are the similarities that are mentioned between the life of this world and water. The third verse we're going to go through is in Surah Kahf also, verses 61 and 63. In verse 61, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the story of Musa alayhi salam and how he traveled with his companion, with his servant, to find Khidr and to learn from Khadir, because of Khadir possessing knowledge which Musa alayhi salam didn't have. And the sign was that the fish would leave the basket and the fish would enter the sea. And in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala discusses and talks about when that event occurred. And he says that when they reached the junction between them, نَسِيَ حُوتَهُمَا, they forgot their fish, فَاتَّخَذَ سَبِيلَهُ فِي الْبَحْرِ سَرَبًا, and the fish took its course into the sea, slipping away. So the fish miraculously slipped out of the basket and made its way into the sea, and basically started swimming into the sea and left them and slipped away. And the word used here is saraba, that the fish took its course into the sea and slipped away. It was slipping away. In verse 63, when the servant of Musa alayhi salam tells Musa alayhi salam what had happened, he says, when we retired at the rock, أَرَأَيْتَ إِذَا وَيْنَا إِلَى الصَّخْرَةِ, do you see when we retired at the rock? فَإِنِّي نَسِيتُ الْحُوتَ, I forgot about the fish, and no one made me forget except Shaitan. وَاتَّخَذَ سَبِيلَهُ فِي الْبَحْرِ عَجَبًا, and it took its course into the sea amazingly, عَجَبًا. So he describes the fish entering the sea as ajaba. In the first ayah, in verse 61, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes it as saraba, the fish slipping away. But in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes it as the fish leaving and entering the sea ajaban, amazingly. Why is saraba mentioned first and ajaba mentioned second? The reason why is because in the first instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking to us about what happened to the fish. The fish went out of the basket and went into the sea, slipping away. It slipped away and eventually went into the water. Saraba. slipping away. In the second instance, it's Musa alayhi salam's servant that's talking about what happened to the fish. And what he saw was amazing. So it wasn't amazing for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because anything is possible with regards to Allah Azza wa Jal. Nothing is difficult for Allah. Nothing amazes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the sense that anything he does, he's capable and fully able of doing them. Whereas for the servant of Musa alayhi salam, when it saw the fish leaving the basket and entering into the sea, that's something amazing, because the fish was supposed to be dead. And so for him, the fish leaving the basket and entering the sea and taking its course into the sea was an ajab. It was an amazing thing. And that's why ajaban is used second, because Musa alayhi salam's servant saw the fish doing that, and it was amazing. It was something amazing that he saw. Whereas in the first example, the word saraba is used because Allah Azza wa Jalla is simply mentioning how the fish went into the water and how it wasn't amazing, because nothing is impossible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Jazakumullah khair for listening. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.